Knight and Changeling, Chapter 23. Explanations. Jen pulled herself to her feet and brushed the dirt off her jeans. The knights were stirring around the room. Cyrus looked absolutely livid that the girl who'd been helping them try to beat Vilgax to the sword was one of their sworn enemies. "You are at fault here, girl." George leveled Ascalon at Cyrus. "Hold your tongue, Sir Cyrus. Not all was told in the tales passed down to my knights who have forgotten their true purpose." Cyrus bowed his head as Kevin stepped over to Gwen, helping her to her feet. He looked around the room.
"I am still very confused as to what the fuck is happening here."
Jen nodded at him. "We shouldn't talk about it here," she said, glancing at the seal. It was cracked much further than it had been, but it was not fully broken yet. George nodded and lifted a hand. In a flash of warm light, they vanished and reappeared in a large room. A round table sat in the center, but it had clearly been moved into the room, as none of the decor around it matched the medieval feel. In fact, it was all pretty advanced technology. Jen shook her head. "You really did borrow Area 51, didn't you?" Kevin looked at her incredulously. That had been a while back, and she hadn't made a peep about it since. George nodded. "As I said, I have every intention of returning it when this is all over." He motioned for her to sit as he took the chair with the Forever Knight symbol carved into it. Jen snorted slightly as she took the seat next to him. Kevin frowned, but sat Gwen down next to Jen and took the seat next to the redhead. The redhead was a bit shaky from the teleportation, but she was still conscious, and considering the power she'd protected them from in the cavern, that was impressive. "I must protest," Enoch said, pulling himself up on the table and glaring at Jen. "She has no place at this table." George raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "She was at this table long before you. She fought the Dagon with me when it first appeared. She defends Earth, as was our original goal. You have forgotten that Earth is not just humanity. It is all peaceful beings who live here." Jen smiled slightly at George's words, and the knights sat down around the table looking chastised. "We should focus, though, George. The Dagon has its heart back. What do we do now?" George nodded, holding up a stone. It was nearly cracked through. "We muster our forces. We prepare for the war. We wait." Jen rolled her eyes. "I hate waiting." George laughed. "I am aware, but I feel you have many things to explain to your friends. Keep a close eye on your cousin." Jen nodded. "A few of Sir Cyrus's men were taken by Villacubra. They need to be found as well. See if this time we can work out how to break the connection. I'll work on it on my end. Keep in touch." George nodded and waved a hand at them. The three of them vanished in a flash of light, and when Kevin opened his eyes, they were sitting in Jen's car outside her house. "Where do you leave your car, Kevin?" It took him a minute to process the question. He gave her directions, and she pulled her car out of the spot in front of her house. They drove in silence for a while, Jen glancing into the back seat. "You have questions?" she asked. Kevin and Gwen nodded in unison.
"I'm not sure where to start,"
Kevin admitted. "You pulled away because you knew it could still get in my head." Jen glanced in the rearview mirror again. She nodded. "Yes. Breaking the Dagon's hold on someone is exceedingly difficult while the Dagon has a presence in the world. Any presence. George says that after it was sealed, the spells broke, but I don't know how it works with the seal nearly broken. I didn't want to risk you." Gwen nodded, looking down at her hands. Kevin frowned.
"Okay, I get that. Especially after what happened back in that warehouse, but who the hell is George, anyway?"
Jen sighed. "A long story that I don't really know all of. He was born in Rome, literally during the golden age of Rome. He's immortal, I guess? I don't really know why. I don't think he knows why. He was in England in the 11th century when the Dagon showed up. Asmith, who is way older than I thought he was, made Ascalon. I don't know if he gave it to George to defeat the Dagon, or if it was some kind of test. I'll never understand Asmith." Gwen frowned. "So the sword's not magic?" Jen shrugged. "Dunno. Possibly. He hasn't told me much about it. All I know is what I saw when I was in the past. It's incredibly powerful. It can do a lot of things. I doubt I saw it all." She shook her head. I didn't want to tell you any of this because I didn't want to risk the Dagon seeing it through you. I still don't know if it's safe. Gwen nodded.
What about breaking the connection? Anyone we know who might be able to do that?
Kevin asked as they pulled up to his car, still parked where they had teleported away from it. I don't know, Jen said. Gwen sat forward. Charmcaster. She might be able to help. Could you get a hold of her? Jen nodded. Why didn't I think of that? I'll call her as soon as I get home. You two should get some sleep. Gwen nodded and exited the car. Kevin frowned.
Were you planning on telling me?
Jen shrugged. I don't know. You and Gwen are so close, I didn't want you to pull away from her. Kevin put a hand on Jen's shoulder.
I will never pull away from your cousin. If I ever abandon her, it'll be kicking and screaming the whole way.
Jen smiled lightly as he got out of the car and into his own. The two of them drove off, Jen following behind them. She stopped at Mr. Smoothie's and got a few smoothies. It had been a long time since she'd been, and she was in need of something to numb her brain for a while. It probably wasn't the healthiest way, drinking ice-cold smoothies until she got brain freeze to distract from her problems, but there were worse ways, and at this point she was just glad she hadn't resorted to them yet. As she carried her smoothies into her room and fished the mirror out of her nightstand, she sighed as she flipped it open and drew the rune to call Charmcaster. The mirror lit up as it was supposed to, but after about 5 minutes it went dark again. Jen frowned. Is she ignoring me? She wondered aloud as she tried again with the same result. She shook her head and set the mirror on the bedside table. The breakup was mutual. We weren't even really dating. Why would she be ignoring me? She yawned and set her phone up on her charger before she drifted off. It had been a long day, and she was still sore and very tired from all the power she'd used. Master Control gave her access to all of her aliens, and she'd used that to her advantage today, but they had still lost. She wouldn't lose again. She promised herself that as she drifted out of the waking world into a mercifully peaceful sleep. Chapter 24. Inspection. Having Gwen insist that they meet up with Julie wasn't how Jen wanted to spend her day, though using Accelerate Speed to beat her at tennis was fun. She hadn't fully forgiven Julie for faking a hostage situation with Conduit Edwards. The Technodon ship that landed was even less pleasant. Inspector 13 didn't know what he was getting into when he took Jen captive, though. She used Upgrade's powers to turn his own ship against him, even before Gwen and Kevin arrived to help. She was already beating on the Weapon Master when they teleported in. Kevin blinked.
Thought you might need help,
he stated, steadying Gwen. Teleportation was still pretty hard on her, though with repetition it seemed to be getting easier. Not really. I appreciate it, though. She turned back to the Weapon Master. Now, as I was saying, the Ultimatrix is not a weapon. You will not be getting it off of me. If you're smart, you'll realize that if you don't give up, I will tear your ship apart before it can rebuild itself, and turn you over to the plumbers for attempted mutilation. The Weapon Master nodded slightly before slumping to the ground unconscious. Jen nodded. She placed a hand on the console and shifted into Upgrade, opening the hatch at the bottom of the ship. She leapt back out of the computer console and out to the hatch, transforming as she went into Big Chill. You guys coming? She asked. Gwen shook her head, a smile on her face as she conjured a platform and she and Kevin stepped aboard. They left the Technodon ship behind as it flew off. Kevin frowned.
Why is it heading downtown?
Big Chill smiled. I programmed it to pick up that Technodon factory they left in the middle of town since nothing else can move it. Gwen nodded, and the three of them made their way back down towards the ground. Did you manage to get a hold of Charmcaster? Big Chill frowned. Not yet. It's a bit concerning. She just isn't answering. Gwen frowned at her cousin. And we don't have the name to open the doors to anywhere anymore, Gwen said as they landed. Jen transformed back to normal and rubbed the back of her neck as Julie made her way up to them. That's not entirely true. Kevin raised an eyebrow.
She essentially gave you a key to Ledger Domain, so you two could keep hooking up?
He was holding back laughter. Maybe. How did you think I got there the last time? Kevin snorted at the blush dusting her cheeks. Why didn't you tell me? Gwen demanded. That was way before all this Dagon stuff. Jen shrugged. She asked me not to. Julie frowned. What's going on? She was still a bit nervous, stepping on eggshells around her friend after what she'd done with the Flamekeeper circle. Jen shrugged. Work stuff. She left it at that, but Kevin seemed to be feeling more ready to forgive Julie.
We're talking about Jen's booty call.
Julie's eyes went wide. Jen smacked Kevin in the shoulder. She's not a booty call, she's a friend. Kevin laughed and bounced his eyebrows as Gwen spotted the Technodon factory taking off from downtown and up through the atmosphere. Gwen frowned. You're sure it'll still work? Jen shrugged. It should, unless she changed the name again. I mean, she has the Alpha rune, she could. Gwen nodded. Meet me tonight at the runway. We'll head to the doors. I have an errand I need to run. Jen nodded and paused as Julie smiled awkwardly. Smoothies are on you this time, the brunette stated, and Julie grinned. Deal. Breaking into Hex's library was surprisingly easy. Gwen had been doing it for a while, borrowing books as she needed them. She should have known she would get caught eventually, but when Hex learned that his niece was ruling Legerdemain with the power of the Alpha rune, he released her.
You do not know what my niece is truly capable of. My niece has studied long and hard with one purpose in mind. She intends to resurrect my brother, her father.
Gwen shook her head, pulling off her Lucky Girl mask. She always wore the disguise when raiding Hex's library. It seemed appropriate. She can't! Magic like that is the darkest kind. Hex nodded.
Indeed. I have advised against it for years, but I don't think she ever listened to me. If she is ruling Legerdemain, she can do as she pleases.
Gwen shook her head, trying to wrap her head around this. Hex looked down, brushing his hood off of his head. He was younger than he should have been, maybe in his early 20s, but he'd had a prolonged encounter with the Fountain of Youth years ago, so it made sense that he wasn't aging like a normal man.
Take whichever book you need, but this may be of the most use to you now.
He lifted a hand, a book sailing into it. He let it fall open. Pink runes bloomed on the page.
The name of Legerdemain has changed.
Gwen nodded, tracing the runes. Gwen made her way to the airfield that evening with the book and her computer in tow. She hoped that Hex was wrong, that the girl Jen had trusted enough to share something deep and intimate with wasn't the kind of girl who could make a deal that would require death for life. But Gwen wasn't sure if that would be the case or not. She was also hoping that if nothing was wrong in Legerdemain, the sorceress would be able to help her break the connection between herself and the Dagon. It would be nice to know that she couldn't be controlled like a puppet anymore. Jen was silent as Kevin flew the rust bucket 3 to the doors. She was fiddling with the mirror Charmcaster had given her. She kept running her finger over the glass in the pattern of the rune that would call Charmcaster, but the mirror just lit up, no response. Kevin frowned.
Will you quit lighting that thing up?
Jen snapped the mirror shut and frowned. Sorry. Kevin shook his head.
Did it occur to you that maybe she just doesn't want to talk to you? I mean, you did break up.
Jen frowned. The thought crossed my mind, but the breakup was mutual and she's... Okay, she can be petty, but I genuinely don't believe she would ignore me like this. Kevin glanced over at Jen.
You know, it's comforting that even after everything we've been through, you're a bit of an optimist.
Jen rolled her eyes, flipping him off as Gwen snorted from behind her computer.